Hello, I'm Patricia Van Skyke, Executive Director of the Lloyd Library and Museum in Cincinnati, Ohio. I'd like to welcome you to today's program, Botany and Botanist in Madagascar, Studying Grasses and Grasslands, with Dr. Maria Vorontsova of Kew Gardens. Today's webinar is hosted in conjunction with our current exhibition, The Enduring Impact of the African Plant Diaspora, which runs through July 25th, 2025. The program series focuses on plants from Africa, with an emphasis on timely topics including conservation and food insecurity. This program, Botany and Botanist in Madagascar, emphasizes the incredible diversity in tropical plants, especially the lesser-known species and their roles in shaping tropical grasslands and savannas. We'll also hear about a project that involves creating a detailed guide to the grass family in Madagascar, combining ecology, plant history, and practical applications, all topics of high priority at the Lloyd Library throughout our history. Before we dive into today's program, I'd like to say a few words about Kew Gardens, near and dear to our hearts. Kew Gardens dates back to the early 18th century as a royal palace, and today it is a globally renowned scientific institute for plant and fungal research. Its library has one of the largest collections of published botanical information in the world. One of our founders, Curtis Gates Lloyd, resided in Kew Gardens in the early 20th century. Many of the treasures in the Lloyd Library come from the knowledge he obtained there and his connections through Kew Gardens. We are honored to have Bat Vorontsova joining us today. Dr. Maria Bat Vorontsova specializes in grasses with a focus on tropical African diversity, poorly known lineages, and the evolution of grasslands and savannas. Her work blends ecological, phylogenetic, and ethnobotanical studies. She also explores plant classifications and nomenclature and manages GrassBase, a global resource compiling taxonomic knowledge on grasses. It is my great pleasure to introduce Bat Vorontsova. Hi, Bat.
Hey, testing. Can everybody hear me okay? Hey, unless anybody complains very loudly, then I will assume that you can hear me. So I'm hoping that you can see my first slide. Um, Most people call me Bat, and I'm one of those incredibly lucky people in the world that are paid to classify plants. So at the Royal Botanic Gardens Kew, we think we probably have the largest herbarium collection in the world of 8 million, maybe, preserved plant specimens. And at the bottom of my first slide, you can see 4 species of grasses that we think are completely unique to Madagascar. So I have been working in Madagascar and looking at these grasses for 15 years already. The time has passed really quickly. So I'm looking forward to taking you on some of this journey with me today. So Madagascar is sometimes considered to be part of the African continent and sometimes not, which is part of the reason why connections and identity for the people in Madagascar have been historically ambiguous. If we look at the map of Africa, Madagascar is located to the east of Mozambique and to the east of South Africa across the Mozambique Channel. But people arrived on Madagascar much later then the rest of the African continent. And the majority of people arrived to Madagascar originally from Indonesia, going past India and then down the Swahili coast in little canoes. And the photo you see on the slide is a very typical kind of environment in the center of the island of Madagascar. It's a picture that I must have taken, I think, in 2012. And the map that you see in set is from the Madagascar Vegetation Atlas, which my colleagues in Kew published from satellite data when it really first became available. So when we look at the map of the island, you see on the eastern side, there's a slither of green wet forest. And this wet forest is kind of the fairy tale rainforest jungle that most people assume Madagascar would have. Then on the right-hand side, the red is the dry deciduous forest. And right in the southern part of the island, the orange that you see, that's the spiny forest. And the ecosystems we are going to be talking about today is all the pale yellow that you see in the middle of this map. So the assumption that most people in Madagascar grow up with is that that space in the middle of the island shouldn't be there. Kids go to school in Madagascar and they're taught that settlers arrived and they decimated the forest that used to cover the island to produce these open systems that shouldn't really be there. And because of this bias, because people weren't really interested in the center of the island and they weren't ever interested in the grasslands or the grasses, historically, these plants didn't receive very much attention. Which turned out to be very lucky for me. I was trained as a tropical plant taxonomist when I did my PhD project on the spurges at Kew Gardens. Actually, I had a part-time job in Kew Library, which was my favorite job in Kew so far. I love libraries, and I got the benefit of shelving or every single new botanical book and journal that came into Kew. So it was a really exciting adventure. And after that, I studied spiny wild aubergines at the Natural History Museum. And then Kew Gardens needed somebody to organize all of their grass taxonomy and take over from grass specialists who were retiring. So I moved to this position in 2010 and discovered that really across Africa, grasses are quite well known. And for those of you who are familiar with the plants of Ohio and plants of US as well, you will know that where you live, the grass species are quite well itemized, and specialists and land managers will know what species they're dealing with locally. That was not the case when I first traveled to Madagascar in 2011. So I was lucky to travel together with Dr. Frank Rakotna-Solo. In Kew Gardens, we currently employ 250 professional scientists, most of whom are based in the United Kingdom. Some of us are in London, some of us are near Brighton in the Millennium Seed Bank. But we also have 50 Malagasy scientists, botanists, and conservation professionals like Frank, who are based in Madagascar. So on my first ever trip, we found on the forefront of this slide, probably it looks a bit like a reed to you, and I thought it was a bit of a funny looking reed. It's sort of greenish blue. And I asked the managers of the Andringitra National Park, well, what is this plant that we see so much around the area? And they knew that the local name was Fatakamanga. It's called the blue bamboo in Malagasy, but nobody really knew how to identify it scientifically and what its Latin name might be. So I collected this plant and I brought it back to the UK and I dissected all of the spikelets. And one of the fantastic benefits of working in Kew Gardens is that we work with professional botanical artists. And I'm very happy to be able to work with Lucy Smith, who actually won a Margaret Flockton Award for the picture that you can see on the slide right now. So she took the blue bamboo and she took it apart. And when we look at grass morphology, you will see how she dissected a lot of the bits that all have specialist terminology. So she took the leaves and she opened out the inside part of the joint between the leaf blade and the leaf sheath, which we call the ligule. And on the right-hand side of the drawing, you can see that every sort of group of modified leaves is called one spikelet. And in the case of this plant, only a small number of these spikelets go on to eventually generate a seed. And you see the upper floret or upper anthecium is the one that's dissected out and drawn by Lucy in glorious detail, really. And in the 21st century, we also have a fantastic benefit of quite cheap and manageable DNA sequencing. So we sequenced the DNA of this grass for the first time. And you should be able to see the evolutionary reconstruction of the history of this grass on the left hand of this slide. So it turned out to be Licantella madagascariensis. It turned out to be a genus that's not found anywhere else except this single mountain on Madagascar. So it turned out to be a really amazing find. And when we compare the DNA sequences of this plant to everything else that we had in our database, we can see that actually this grass was quite key in the evolutionary history of both sugarcane and corn, which we also call maize. So on the left, you see the evolutionary tree of all the grasses. The blue ones tend to grow in colder climates and they use the C3 photosynthetic system. And the orange and red ones grow in hotter climates. And they have a slightly different kind of photosynthesis, which we'll come back to later on in this talk. And we came to the conclusion that actually Licantella madagascariensis was pretty ancient in Madagascar. Grasses are very easy to overlook. It's easy to assume that they're in the wrong place and they're not really relevant to the biodiversity. But this is actually a very unique wild relative of sugar cane and of corn. And now its genome sequences and the plants are being used to better understand how sugarcane and corn came to be. And also on my first trip to Madagascar, so this is my photo of what a typical forest fragment looks like in Malagasy Highlands. And you can see that in the understory, under the trees, there are little plants that they look a bit like palm leaves to most people. And actually, it turned out to be a clade of grasses completely unique to Madagascar with Oplisminus and Poaceae listachys. And having sequenced their DNA, we know that they arrived in Madagascar 10 to 18 million years ago. So it's absolutely true that grasses are ancient in Madagascar. And next, I also started working in more open environments. So in this picture, you see Nanjerisua Olenirina Priska, who was the first student working towards her MSc with me. And currently she's working towards a PhD. And what you see her doing is holding a circle that's delimiting around plot. So we developed a rapid ecological method to study the classification of the grasses at the same time as their ecological associations. This work took place in open ecosystems in a very hot and arid dry part of southern Madagascar. So these strange trees you see in the background are tree euphorbias. They're very drought resilient. And they're very beautiful and spectacular plants. But what's really interesting for us is those little grasses you see on the forefront, because people who live in that part of Madagascar are very much dependent on their livestock and their grazing animals. But it's so dry, not very many kinds of grasses are able to survive, and nobody really seemed to know what their grasses are. But we managed to figure out that actually the grasses that you see in the forefront are called Panicum pseudovolscoviae, and it's amazingly a completely unique lineage, restricted only to the coasts of Madagascar, of all things. So all of these samples, we study them by creating herbarium specimens, and then we deposit them in the herbarium in Antananarivo in Madagascar, and I also bring them back to the Royal Botanic Gardens Kew in the UK to compare them to the collections we already have. So by the look of the computer in this slide, you can probably tell straight away that this photo is really quite old. And I used to have long hair back then. That's me on the left-hand side of the picture. So that was also a fair while ago. But really, this slide is here to show you how we do the process of taxonomy. So most people take it for granted that every species on Earth, it has a Latin name. We can identify it using identification keys. We can sequence its DNA. Species are different from one another. But really, for many plant species, the definitions of the species are not fully known yet, and the work of the taxonomy and systematics isn't really complete. So what I'm doing in this picture, it was taken during my postdoctoral work, maybe around 2008, is I'm looking at every single dry specimen of one species to try to delimit the morphological variability within that species. I'm looking at the biggest ones, the smallest ones, the thinnest ones, the brightest colored ones, and I'm writing up a description on my laptop. But working in Madagascar, this working process is really quite challenging. So going through it, I really began to understand why people didn't know much about the grasses and why there remains such a knowledge gap. So the important thing is to know that Madagascar, so in this slide, you can now see what I was saying earlier. Madagascar is in green. Madagascar is located to the east of the African continent. This is an equal area map projection. You see the shape and the size of the continents is a bit different to what you usually see. And so on this map, we can see how big Africa really is. It's an equal area projection. So the plants we're looking at are located on the green island of Madagascar. But Madagascar used to be a French colony. So historically, in the early 20th century, and before Madagascar was independent as a country, all the interesting samples, scientists collected them and they used to remove everything from the country, absolutely everything, and they used to take it to France. And before Madagascar was a French colony, there was a brief period when Madagascar was actually a British colony. So some samples also made their way to Britain. So in order to really understand what things have been collected before, what morphologies are possible, what do they look like, things that we collect in Madagascar, I have to compare them to physical dry plants that are in Paris to plants that are in London and also to plants that are in South Africa. And South Africa, incidentally, is a very famous center of high quality grass classification. But imagine how long it takes. Many, many dry plants, obscure dry plants, and they're located in 4 different countries in the world, and it's quite expensive and time consuming to travel between these 4 countries and exchange information. And on the next slide, we can see more detail of what this work looks like and why it's so challenging. So this is an example of one of the papers I published in 2014 when we collect these grasses in Madagascar. So they're taken to the UK. And again, this is Lucy Smith, the same artist, and she dissected this grass. So again, she took the leaves, she opened out the leaf blade and the leaf sheath. The little thing with the fringe you see in the top middle of the slide is called the ligule. And then on the left is all the different modified leaves that make up the grass spikelet. So we have to compare the glooms. We have the lower gloom, we have the upper gloom, one side, the other side, then we have the lower lemma, we have the lower floret, etc. But the total size of the spikelet on this plant is less than 1 millimeter. So one thing I immediately encountered in Madagascar is the understanding that there just weren't the microscopes that could give people enough of a magnification to really do this work easily. So actually, it wasn't technically possible. And I've always liked looking at small things because I happen to be quite short-sighted because I read too many books under the blanket when I was a small child. So without my glasses, I can see really small things. But the majority of my students and colleagues in Madagascar are quite the opposite, like they grow up in a more healthy way, so they tend to be long-sighted, which makes it more difficult to notice small details. Um, So the grass that you see in this picture is unique, which we call endemic to Madagascar. But people thought that the grasslands maybe were not natural because the grasses in them were not unique. So we come to the next slide. And this is again quite a typical landscape for central Madagascar. There's rolling hills. There are a lot of fires. And what you see in the middle is what used to be a wet forest fragment going along the stream, but fires hand removed most of the trees. And at the forefront of the photo, there's a kind of a brown grass, which is Lutetia simplex. And before we started work, everybody said, well, Lutetia simplex, it occurs in Madagascar and it occurs in Africa. Therefore, people must have brought it to Madagascar. So these grasslands are just full of alien invasive African grasses. How awful. So I organized a bit of a project to really look at the genetic diversity of this grass. So we collected many, many samples from all across the central part of Madagascar, from different parts of South Africa. And if you look at the top left side, so apologies for this very graph heavy slide. I promise this is going to be the most intimidating sciencey slide. Yeah, there shouldn't be many more of these later on in the talk. But for now, I don't know how many people here know that plants have 3 different kinds of genomes. So both plants and animals, most of our DNA are in the nuclear genome. The nuclear genome is very large, and you see a nuclear. So the nuclear sequences were analyzed using a technique we called microsatellites. So we read many, many, many repeats in the grass genome. And we found that those grasses had different numbers of nuclear genomes, which is part of a phenomenon called polyploidy. So all humans and me, I've got one set of genes from dad and one set of genes from mum. So all humans are diploid and it's normal. Probably a lot of the plants are diploid too, but a lot of the plants have more than just a two set of genomes. So on the slide that you can see 2x in the Drakensberg and in the Transvaal in South Africa, those grasses, Lutetia simplex, are just like people. They have just the two genomes. But all of the ones in Madagascar, they have different sequences and they have greater numbers of genomes. But if people brought these grasses to Madagascar only quite recently, we'd expect them to be genetically identical to the South African ones. In fact, the ones in Madagascar, they are genetically different. The analyses on the right-hand side also show that the morphology in Madagascar is unique and long adapted to different Malagasy niches. So we, in fact, concluded, and we published a few papers to explain this, that the Lutetia simplex in Madagascar and all of these grasslands, even though the species is not unique to the island, it's definitely ancient and arrived there a long time before people. So I'm making the sound kind of quite easy because I'm just presenting to you the final results after a number of years of research. So I thought I would like to inject maybe some daily reality into this talk as well to show you what it's really like to do this work on the ground. So, lived experience of carrying out research in Madagascar while I'm thinking about these microsatellites and polyploid grass genomes and what are we going to do next. Actually, I'm spending hours and hours of my day stuck in traffic. So, this photo I took in the capital city of Madagascar in Antananarivo. And in the Malagasy language, Antananarivo, it means a city on 9 lakes. So there are 9 lakes where rice is grown, interspersed with hills. This is the town center on a hill, and the infrastructure is so poor, there are such a small number of roads that getting from anywhere to anywhere else can take an absolutely unpredictable amount of time in Tana. So most of my time is spent just like this. Like it's very pretty. Antananarivo is said to be the most beautiful city in Africa. But it smells bad. It's very loud. And here I am sitting in traffic, taking photos out of the front of my car. And then we get out in the field, as the botanists say. So when we get out of Tana to do some field work and to look for these grasses, this is the kind of scene that we often encounter. So the guy in blue on the left-hand side of the slide is my friend Roger Rajoanarison. He's also our mechanic and driver. It's a good idea in Madagascar to not go anywhere without a mechanic who can repair the Land Rover pretty much on the spot whenever something goes wrong. And in this case here, you see that Madagascar has wet seasons and dry seasons every year, but grasses only flower in the wet season. And in order to classify the plants, I have to see them flowering. So I go traveling in the worst season possible when there are really horrible floods. So poor Roger in this picture, I think, is in quite a foul mood because he's realized that we can't actually get past without towing some trucks of our way. So this is him planning to get some ropes together, pull the truck out before we can get past in our 4x4. Yeah, it's not a fast way to get around by any stretch of the imagination. Um, and here is another picture from northern Madagascar wet season. In this case, you are looking at a river which got flooded, and these enterprising guys brought several canoes. Then they put pieces of wood on the canoes, and they're making a bit of a business by transporting cars across the flood. So we could pay a 30,000 Ari, which is about, I think, 10 American dollars nowadays, to have our car transported like that on canoes. And I have to report that in this case, Roger took one look at this and said, I'm sorry, this actually isn't safe. Like, we don't want to risk getting washed away and we don't want to die. So we had to turn right back and we weren't able to achieve our field work this time in 2013. Yeah. And sadly to say that Madagascar does see a number of deaths every year in these floods because, nine out of 10 times it's safe, but you don't want to be there the 10th time when something goes wrong with the wood and the canoes and everybody ends up in the water. It's not really good. So the next slide is a typical Malagasy home. We've been welcomed by many lovely people on our various journeys. And here you see us being served dinner and coffee. Um, so this is one of the coastal huts in Madagascar, which is sort of kept up on a kind of a leg structure. You see traditional Malagasy pots. Um, we all have to sit on the floor on mats to eat. And yeah, I guess it's a comforting kind of nice homely scene for me. And more interesting bits from central Madagascar. So now I'd like to open this up for contributions. I hope the audience is still awake. I hope I didn't bore you too much with all the graphs and multiple genomes. So does anybody know? Would anybody like to guess what this is? I'm now going to check the chat. Mhm. I'm going to have to figure out how to check the chat. I'm maximizing. So if you have any idea what this might be, please type it in the chat and I'll wait a couple of minutes. Larvae, beans, beetles. Yes, it's insect. Yeah, yeah. Insect in star stages is exactly correct. And they're actually edible silk moth larvae. So larvae is absolutely the correct answer. A lot of little children, like the one you see in this picture, they make a living in central Madagascar by collecting these larvae, and they're actually incredibly nutritious, especially for people that struggle to get enough calories to stay healthy. And struggle to get enough protein to stay healthy. So these are fried and I, I have to admit that I haven't actually eaten any. I'm not vegetarian, but I haven't, yeah, I guess I haven't, haven't quite been hungry enough. But these particular insects and the silk moths are incredibly important in the local culture of central Madagascar because when they do go through to make moths, they make a unique local Malagasy kind of silk. And then this silk is spun into beautiful fabrics. And the fabric is used as funeral shrouds. And when proposing marriage, you give this fabric to the bride that you're hoping to marry. So, yeah, and the moths and the larvae live in the trees that we call tapir trees, which are also unique to central Madagascar. Okay, it's time for the next quiz. Please put in the chat what you think. So this is a photo of my arm. It's taken in 2015. You can see my green watch strap. So what is that interesting thing, kind of brown and long? Somewhat spotty. Yeah. So I'll wait a few minutes for people to put their ideas down. Gosh, this is a very knowledgeable audience. It's a leech. Yeah. So when I was a small child, I grew up in Soviet Russia. And we had big, thick black leeches that I didn't ever see them biting people, but this is a little leech. So in the forest, those guys are like on trees and in the bushes, And when they smell sweat or when they smell animals, they tend to drop on you sort of from above. And then they walk up your arm. And what they do is they love to find like a warm armpit, or they love to get under your clothes, and then they find a really good place. You suddenly have a lot of blood dripping down because they inject you with a thing that makes it not painful. And then they like to drink lots of your blood and drop off. Yeah, so lots of interesting adventure. In the beginning, I was quite uncomfortable with them, but I guess I barely noticed now. You just sort of flicking them off is the thing to do whenever you notice them. And this is a picture of like an average ordinary town in central Madagascar. So on the bottom right hand of the slide, I don't know if you can see a bit of British Land Rover, a white one there in the corner. That's the car we arrived in. And this is a pretty normal kind of scene. It's always strange for me, really, to think that I am currently in a country that's actually the poorest country in the world, that's not currently at war. And even like I've asked professional economists about this and international development specialists, and it's one of those things that nobody really understands why Madagascar's so poor and why it struggles so much with its economy and infrastructure. Because logically, quite a number of countries used to be parts of empires. And for example, Brazil is doing amazingly now, even though it used to be part of the Portuguese Empire, but not so for Madagascar, sadly. It's this is another sort of sad statistic and another typical scene from my fieldwork. The road infrastructure as we have it today was actually built before Madagascar became independent. So the road we're looking like at here, it was probably last renovated in 1960, which was 65 years ago. And especially in a tropical climate, 65 years doesn't do anything good to the road infrastructure, especially when people around suffer from quite extensive poverty and they need to use wood for keeping themselves warm and for cooking. So a lot of the wood does tend to disappear from bridges, and then we often end up carrying wood on the roof of our vehicles, and we have to stop every now and again and repair the road, which doesn't make one's journey much faster. We are back here. You might recognize Dr. Frank Rakotonosolo from the first slide. He's actually a specialist on the coffee family. The coffees are incredibly diverse in Madagascar, and Frank is probably the most knowledgeable Malagasy botanist alive today. He remembers incredible numbers of Malagasy species, and he's fantastic at inspiring young people and students to identify them. Um, he's now retired, having done this work for much of his life. But because of all these practicalities and because of the practical load of difficulties that we encounter every day working in Madagascar, Dr. Rakotonosolo in any other country, he would be mostly sitting in his office and he would be giving advice to all the people desperate to learn from him. But actually, on trips like the one I'm showing you here, he also has to be an expert on how to rescue the car when this kind of disaster happens on a bridge. So we were moving along one of those bridges like the ones I showed you on the previous slide. But in this case, we didn't have one of our professional driver mechanics like Roger. We had a driver who was a bit less experienced in going over difficult bridges in the countryside. So he got a bit optimistic and almost fell, the car fell through the bridge, which is, yeah, that was a bit of a nerve-wracking day. Like I didn't really want to fall through the bridge and end up in the water. We were fine in the end, but we had to get a number of local people organized by Frank to bring lots of wood, get the car to reverse, repair the bridge, get the car to go forward again. And yeah, we lost a bit of a day. We lost a day in terms of time. It was quite stressful, and time and money are always limited. So, for me, as a foreigner in Madagascar, I guess I'm always trying to understand all the contributing factors that contributed towards things being that way. And I'm always thinking how to make it a bit less bad. But it's hard. It's hard because there's so many obstacles to overcome. And this is apologies for the poor quality of this slide. It's very informative, but I haven't been able to find a high quality copy. This is the size of every country in the world according to how many research papers they produce. So instead of the area of the country, we have like the more papers the country produces, the bigger the area. So United States in pale blue had the highest scientific output. It's a bit out of date now. I think this, oh, I beg your pardon, the graphic dates back from about 2015. And then Britain, where I'm located at the moment, and France and Europe, they have quite big scientific output. So that's why these countries appear bigger than they actually are in the graphic. Then the purple one you see is Japan. Also, they publish disproportionately to how many people they have. And then if you look at Europe and you go down to this like really weird slither, you see that Africa and Madagascar in pink are almost non-existent on this slide because they publish so few scientific papers. It's only really South Africa that's at all visible. Yeah, and I guess because of all these impediments and the poverty, I hope I've given you some understanding of why it's so difficult to get scientific output to come from Madagascar. And this is really why, talking to you now, I'm a British scientist located in the UK. Like, I would love to have been a Malagasy person giving this talk from Madagascar. And all of this really helped me think about how many poor tropical regions in the world, they differ fundamentally from places like Britain and the US, in that their plants are not studied by locals, their plants are studied by foreigners. So the grass you see in this slide is Panicum subhystrix, and that grass was really also an important learning point for me because when I studied the specimens of this grass in Paris Herbarium, they were originally named by a botanist active in early 20th century called Madame Amy Camus. She was the daughter of a very famous expert in bamboos, and she described four different species, which were all different variants of this one grass, because when it doesn't flower, it tends to have quite narrow leaves with no hairs. And when it flowers, the leaves can be much wider and it becomes very hairy. So when I saw this plant living in its native environment in central Madagascar, just by walking around and having a look, it can be obvious that the morphology is different depending on exact habitat, depending on whether it's reproducing, depending on the time of year. It's a very adaptive, morphologically variable grass, which is quite normal for grasses. But if the scientist studying the grass has never had the benefit of looking at it in the field, looking at it in person, it's easy to come to completely different taxonomic conclusions. So my conclusion here is the only hope of getting highest quality science done on plants is to have somebody who lives near the plants look at them as regularly as possible. So with that message, I'm going to draw the talk to a close. And on this final slide, you can see I want to say thank you to all of our Malagasy experts, scientists, and taxonomists. On the right-hand side, so this was taken last year in Kew Gardens. On the right-hand side is Dr. Helen Raleigh-Manana, who's my friend and colleague. We did our PhDs at the same time on the Spurges, and she's now the leader of Kew Madagascar, organizing everything for us in country. And the man on the left-hand side is Madagascar's Minister of the Environment. And I also want to show this slide to say thank you to everybody at Kew Gardens, where many aspects of the colonial legacy and the history are difficult to overcome, but sometimes we have some positive aspects as well because of our old connections that Kew still has with so many countries in Africa, so many countries in the tropics. We can have the kind of influence that Malagasy scientists struggle to have. So the Minister for the Environment visited Kew. He heard all about the grasses. He met our Malagasy staff. And with this kind of work, as well as doing the science itself, we're also trying to influence Malagasy policy to care for their biodiversity, to do better conservation, together with Malagasy citizens and British citizens and everybody else, really. So I'm going to end my slideshow here and open this up for questions. Okay, screen sharing has stopped. Yeah, good.
Thank you, Beth. That was fascinating. I see that one of the members of our audience had asked, what sort of fauna does dry grasslands support?
So at the moment, we know of one bird, Margaroperdix, Malagasy endemic bird that lives predominantly in the grasslands. There are many unique ants. There are grass specialist termites. The reason that people thought grasses weren't native is because they didn't really know of any large animals, large wild animals that were restricted to the grasslands. But in Madagascar, as many people know, there was a large megafaunal extinction about 1,500 years ago, and it's often quite difficult to figure out what really happened before these large animals went extinct. So we think that a lot of the larger animals did eat grasses in the dry grasslands, and those were the pygmy hippos, two species. There was an elephant bird, and we found remnants of that in the central grassland. And another kind of fun one for dry grasslands is giant tortoises. The generic name is Aldabra chelys, and on the Aldabra Mountains in Rodriguez, these giant tortoises are still around and they eat the grasses down to form what's called tortoise turf. It's quite amazing, really. And the giant tortoises are now used for a lot of rewilding projects in Madagascar.
That's fascinating. I especially liked your picture of the leech. One of the things that the Lloyd Library focuses on is not just plants and nature, but actually its intersection in the history of medicine. And so we, of course, are very aware that leeching was once a medicinal practice. I've seen plenty of illustrations, but this is the first time I've ever seen a photograph of a leech on a human body. So that was quite interesting. Along that lines, Andrea in our audience has asked, have you had experiences with the tick fauna?
A good question, thank you. I have never had a tick in Madagascar. And to be honest, I don't really know why, because in South Africa, like the minute I arrived in South Africa, I was covered in ticks. And I think they do exist in Madagascar, but they seem to be less prominent. There's fewer of them. I guess it's true that whenever I go out into the grassland, I always wear covered shoes and I tuck my trousers that are should be extra long into my socks. And that tends to prevent any creepy crawlies or leeches going inside my feet, really.
Going back to the topic of leeches and medicine, are any of the grasses, do they have medicinal uses amongst the people in Madagascar?
There are quite a few species that have reported medicinal uses. To be honest, this part of the ethnobotanical work, I'm sometimes a little bit skeptical about for two reasons. First reason is when botanists like me, when we travel around Madagascar, we always work with local people and we have local guides who are paid to keep us happy, essentially. And we always ask, like, what are the useful properties of this plant, and like the more information you give to the foreign botanist to write down, the happier they are. So sometimes there's a kind of a feeling that people will give us lots of information to keep us happy, independently of how useful these plants maybe truly are for medicine. And the second reason I'm skeptical is sadly, a lot of Malagasy countryside has very poor access to Western healthcare. Medicines are expensive, medicines are difficult to get, there aren't many doctors around. And in these kinds of circumstances, people do tend to use whatever plants are around. There's always a folklore associated with them. And I've compiled database information of literally every single grass is said to be like a cure for stomach ache, a cure for depression, helpful with sickness during pregnancy. And like, I guess I'm a scientist and I'm paid to be cynical, so I'm allowed to be a little bit skeptical about that.
So one of the things that you've talked about is the the isolation of Madagascar and also how difficult it is, at least for vehicles to get around, here in the United States. And I'm guessing it may be an issue where you are as well, as a big problem with invasive plants, non-native plants that are choking out the native plants and really creating some environmental havoc. Um, are invasive plants at all an issue in Madagascar?
That's a fantastic question, Patricia. Thank you very much. Um, Sometimes when I give this kind of talk, a lot of people get slightly the wrong idea that I think all grasses are good and none of the grasses are harmful invasive aliens, which isn't really the case at all. The problem that we face in Madagascar is very poor level of knowledge. Um, and Having done this work for 15 years, I'm not going to claim to have all the answers. So one student project that I didn't show you today is by a student called Fenitra, who's doing her PhD with me now. And literally last week, she submitted her first ever paper overview of all of Madagascar's grasses, trying to assess which ones are harmful aliens and which ones should be barred from the country. And the results of her PhD research actually were quite shocking to me because Fenitra went through all of the global databases and many, many papers, and she found that about 200 species of grasses were officially listed as alien and invasive. And she tried to confirm these using evidence. And actually, more than half of the claims online seem to be complete rubbish. Like, a lot of these things aren't even in the country. Um, a lot of these things, like Lutetia simplex, people say it's an invasive alien, but actually it's a native species. But at the same time, we recorded now at least 10 species of grasses that are new introductions to Madagascar, and we strongly suspect are going to be really quite harmful. Um, we are using a lot of expertise from South Africa and from colleagues in South Africa. So we look at whatever grasses have been causing havoc with South African ecosystems, and we want people to be especially cautious with them in Madagascar. Yes, so there's quite a few, and we're trying to list them, but I'm sure we haven't even uncovered half of that problem. Yeah.
So also, you is very clear how difficult it is for vehicles to get around and get to the grasses. Does that mean that many of the places where you were and where you conduct your research, there's very little human activity there? Or do the folks get there, but they get there by non-vehicle methods?
A good question. I think it's true to say that a lot of Madagascar in the wet season, actually in other times of year too, there are simply no roads. So no vehicles go there. Um, it's this issue isn't quite the same as whether they're populated by people or not, because uh, in the old times, before we had motor vehicles, um, people move things using horses. In Madagascar, there are zebu livestock, which is a Bos indicus. It's a kind of cow which is more resilient to tropical landscapes with a hump. Um, so zebu carts are a big thing in Madagascar. So there's this cow, zebu, with a cart, and using zebu carts actually can get through any kinds of terrain. And in many parts of the country, also, you just walk, like to get to your village or from your village. People just walk for many days to bring food, to go to school. But it's also true that Madagascar is bigger than France, like it's a big place, and significant parts of the country are not settled at all. Often there are places with more poor soil, places with less drinking water. Um, in a way, a lack of vehicle access can be a positive thing for conservation because if you can't get there, you can't trash the place. So I'm, I guess I try to console myself thinking that biodiversity is alive and happy in these places where we can't get to. And like the biodiversity is probably going to be better if no humans arrive there at all.
And I really like that you ended on a hopeful note. And Andrea, again, from our audience said, exactly, since half the population is under 18, perhaps we can inspire the youth to restore and save Madagascar.
Thank you very much. Exactly. I guess that's exactly what we're trying to do with our research program. It can be depressing at times because there's a really long way to go. My very personal opinion is probably it's not going to happen in the big way until people are lifted out of poverty, because when people don't have the luxury to care about nature because they need to get food for their kids right now, that's like I can talk to them about biodiversity as much as I like, but they'll still need to feed their children. So the way we work nowadays is I haven't talked about this as much today, but we try to apply something we call nature-based solutions, where we're supporting biodiversity at the same time as supporting local economies, at the same time as supporting people. So we've been supporting zebu farmers. And when people feel a bit more financially and economically secure, then we find that they become a lot more ready to look at plants and appreciate their flora and safeguard the biodiversity as well.
That's perfect. We actually have a program in June where somebody that's done a lot of work in Kenya is making exactly the same point. Their organization is supporting both the infrastructure and addressing poverty and issues that are facing the community with the idea that you can't really address environmental problems if you try to keep it separate from the things you just explained. So thank you very much for also giving us a segue to an upcoming program for us. That it was wonderful. Thank you so much. And I'd also like to thank the audience for joining us. Our programs are posted on the Lloyd Library's YouTube channel, and programs like these are supported by the members of the Lloyd Library. If you're a member, thank you. If you're not a member, I encourage you to join us. You can find information about membership on our website, lloydlibrary.org. And we hope to see you next time. Bye. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. Goodbye. Thank you.